So Dr. Roop, thank you so much for joining us. Can you first tell us about the essence of your work? You basically, you do studies on climate, but you also figure out ways to find practical applications in real life. So tell us how you do this.
That's a great $1 million question, I guess. And I think there are multiple ways of doing it, which we'll maybe dig into here a bit. But my primary mission and objective in my role is to generate cutting edge climate related science, but critically to do science that's useful and usable. So that in part requires understanding what challenges people have on the landscape related to climate and climate impacts, and what's sort of holding them back from deploying solutions or embracing the opportunities that come with the challenges of climate. And I think critically about what sort of science is needed and partnerships are needed to help address those challenges that are articulated by people out there in quote unquote the real world, right? Sort of really doing science that's responsive to real world needs.
What is the top thing that you wish journalists knew about people like you and their work?
I wish that everyone knew that while we're confronting what is no question a paramount challenge for society, climate will impact the lives of every single person on the planet today. But what I wish people knew and the ways in which we were framing the story was around the solutions and the opportunities we have as we face this crisis. We have opportunities to what I have colleagues call multi-solve, use this challenge and our need to respond to it today to solve other challenges that we face as society. Environmental justice related issues, human health issues, challenges with our infrastructure and our built environment. Climate change is forcing us to re-envision the world. And why couldn't we at the same time think about addressing all of these other challenges? So I really wish, while it is clear that there are a range of impacts related to climate, from heat waves and droughts to floods and changing precipitation patterns and impacts on food systems, that we were thinking not only about the negative challenges and those impacts, but all of the solutions that people are actively exploring that we know we need to deploy across landscapes at scale.
Particular, my students are looking at Northeast Georgia, they're doing hyperlocal news. So where are the places where they're most likely to find the solution in practice?
In the case of agriculture, I know I'm based in Minnesota. One of the things that there's a lot of promise for, but it's a very complex topic. It's thinking about new crop varietals and putting in new types, growing new food sources, and developing new varietals, but that serve multiple purposes. So they can thrive in changing conditions. Some of these crops have deeper root systems, and so they inherently reduce erosion that is going to increase as a result of extreme precipitation. It also improves the health of our soils, which means that we have less, we're basically using them as a carbon store. And so we're keeping carbon in our soils, which reduces our emissions. And so there are lots of sort of angles to stories and these complex stories, but where, someone growing a new crop, that actually involves the scientist involved in sort of creating the new crop, all the way through to the farmer who owns the land, who has to be willing to plant that crop and experiment and, quite frankly, assume some risk in experimenting along with the scientific community. And then, of course, if we carry this example even further, it's not enough just to grow a new crop, even if it's great for the environment and great for your farm and your soil health. You need to be able to sell that crop. So there has to be a market for the crop. Then there have to be people at the store who want to buy it, or who want to drink a beer that's made out of this grain, and so that people are really thinking about systems and all the different people and processes that are in place that would say, put the idea of, oh, what if we have, these new crops and they have deep root systems, we're solving all these problems. There are all these other parts of the system that have to be considered as well. And I think that's the challenge and the beauty of this sort of storytelling with these complex kind of environmental stories that have really deep personal connections and roots in them as well.
Let's continue with the analogy of the farmer. A farmer needs to know about a solution that could help them with a problem that they're experiencing here in Northeast Georgia. So how do students find the right study, the right sources? Where do they begin again to look at, let's say, UGA? And it's a huge institution with a lot of complex studies being carried out.
So I would encourage in this case, starting with the asset that is UGA and looking towards research centers and individual faculty that have lab groups and graduate students who are often the ones doing a lot of the work and in the lab, who are really often very skilled and eager to communicate about the things that they're doing, the research that they're doing. And so I definitely start with the sort of primary sources of the people generating the data, and those folks are at your institution. And so I think I would just say that as with reaching out to any contact or anyone that you'd like to interview, at the end of the day, we're all people. And of course, some of us are better at responding to email than others, and I'm guilty as charged. I'm not wonderful, but just remember we're all people at the other end of that request. And so just know that even if it is a senior researcher or a graduate student, more often than not, we really want to have an opportunity to share our story. And it's sort of, the question goes both ways. I work with a lot of researchers who just don't know how to connect with a journalist. How do I tell my story? I'm not trained in storytelling. That's your expertise. So how can we build networks and bridges together? So I think just know that often you're bringing real value, especially to the research community, where so many of us want to tell our stories, but don't know how or who to contact.
What would you advise students to do as they start reporting on this very complex, sometimes very politically sensitive information?
Relying on primary sources. If you're not clear, double check or triple check, and ask for help if you need it. And just put a critical eye on if you're relying on literature or things you find online. Look for primary sources. Look at articles that have gone through the peer-reviewed process, which is the way in which we get all of our work sort of vetted by our academic and disciplinary communities. And always take a glance at where funding comes from for particular studies. They may appear to be peer-reviewed, but they might have undue influence by outside sources, including highly political think tanks and other things that may or may not be influencing the framing or the outcome of a given report or paper. So, just being really careful with your sources and making sure you understand the who and the what and the how for the resources that you're using.
If we switch now to the equity part, the environmental justice part, again, sticking with your subject matter, which is climate change is disproportionately affecting a lot of African Americans, a lot of minorities, poor people, homeless people, the elderly. What are the main sources, scientific sources, and the places where students can find those important stories in practice, again, connecting the science with real life?
So there's no question that climate change, while it will impact everyone, it is not and will not impact everyone equally. So there are disproportionate impacts from a changing climate. And that is well documented in the literature. We see, exposure to these impacts is not equal. The ability to recover and repair after natural hazards, and some of those that are being intensified and worsened by climate, it's just no question that it is unequally distributed, and our abilities to respond and recover are also not equal. And so there is a lot of work nationally and internationally working to sort of close those gaps, prioritize solutions in those spaces and with those communities who are often best equipped to articulate needs and priorities and what solutions will work. And so there's a real paradigm in even how the work is being done, which is so important to getting it right, or working towards getting it right, and having it really serve communities, rather than trying to craft one size fits all solutions, which we know just won't work. I personally look to my local Department of Health for a lot of this information. They often have mapping tools and aggregate a bunch of census data, which tells us things about demographics, socioeconomic context of communities at the sort of census tract level, which of course does not necessarily represent a community. But many departments of health are sort of at the cutting edge and at the front line of bringing a lot of this information together. So that is a place where I would start.
And I wanted to also look at the local government perspective of, for example, again, if the students are looking at Athens-Clarke County or local other counties here, in general, what should they be looking for to make sure that the sustainability programs are really doing what they should be doing?
There's sort of a lot of power and opportunity held up at that level of governance. One place to start is to see, are there plans? Has leadership articulated a plan about its goals related to sustainability, or more specifically related to climate? Is there a climate action plan or some sort of climate related plan that sets forward the ambitions or the goals that the city or the county have articulated as working to meet? And are they on track to meet those, as far as, meeting some sort of greenhouse gas emissions reduction target, or, putting a certain amount of green infrastructure in place? So that's a great place to start, is to say, is there a plan? Has that been articulated in a plan or in some other documentation? And then you can reference that against some of the science. So a place you might start is sort of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has very clear recommendations for where we need to be for our greenhouse gas emissions reductions and our sort of the amount of carbon that we're storing and capturing from the atmosphere. And so you can sort of, it's of course more complicated than that. There's more research to do than that, but that's a good starting point, is like, is the articulated plan and goals ambitious enough or realistic enough to meet what we know from the international policy and scientific communities is required? And so I think that there's a real place for seeing hope and progress and momentum and interest by looking at stories, especially those of like what's happening by local leaders and lawmakers in my community, who really are, quite frankly, in many cases, elected to make decisions and help shape the future on our behalf. And so it's totally reasonable to question whether that's working for us or reflects the needs and priorities of a community or not, and then work towards crafting what those solutions, right? And that's a collaborative process. So I'd love to see more reporting along those lines.
And the last pillar of sustainability, that is the business side, industry. Here in Georgia, the state appears to be poised to be a major player in the electric battery business. We have a South Korean plant which recently opened. Looking at that part of the equation, from a scientific research point of view, how do students cover the story and make sure that again, they have the right perspective? Is there any advice you could give them?
There are a lot of businesses that have also realized that it's in their best interest, financial and otherwise, to be making real leaps and strides related to all sorts of sustainability related issues. A lot of companies have teams of people or individuals who are tasked with both championing sort of sustainability work and analyzing it, analyzing company and industry data to make sure that they're contributing. And so, I think, again, just knowing your sources, coming with a critical eye, and making sure you're telling a complete story is really important. So I wouldn't say it's totally dissimilar But also another wonderful place where I think people might be surprised at the amount of work and critical thought and data analysis and other things that all sorts of private sector industries are working on in the sustainability realm.
Also, there is the issue of greenwashing.
Absolutely.
So any advice from your point of view as a scientist and an academic?
Oh, this again, it's sort of doing your research and in some cases, unlike public sector where information is generally publicly available and open to be, interrogated, there are lots of things that private companies do not have to report, and so it can be a harder challenge in terms of making sure you understand the landscape. And again, it might be a similar, looking at the ambitions as they're articulated and the ways in which companies are going about their sustainability related practices, and comparing that to what the science says is sort of needed. Is it big enough, fast enough? Are they putting their money into the right things, or is it that it's an element of greenwashing there? It's sort of like Bitcoin is maybe a very simplistic example, right? On the surface, it's like, oh, there's they can reduce risk of loss, and it's safer, it's more secure. There's all sorts of failed things in that, but it has a massive environmental footprint. So it burns a ton of energy. So it's again like really thinking about systems, thinking about impacts and interconnections. I think is a way that you really make sure you're telling the true depth and angles on a story.
Any advice you would give students as they look at such a complex issue, which they have to understand? It's hard for all of us to understand, let alone explain to ordinary people, let alone show how it looks in real life. So anything from your own struggles with communicating this complex systemic problem that you can share with us?
I think, embrace the complexity and the messiness, start with one piece at a time and sort of build the puzzle that way. And just know that, sort of as you take these puzzle pieces and you build a deeper understanding of the system, it inevitably is going to lead you to ask new questions, to have new stories to tell. And so it is sort of the beginning of I think an exciting, never-ending sort of storytelling process. And so you don't have to put the whole 1,000-piece puzzle together at once, tackle it one piece at a time. And you may be missing a corner piece, but that might be the next deep dive story that you tell that's going to open up a whole nother way of thinking and viewing a problem and the world and the associated solutions.
Dr. Heidi Roop, thank you very much, and I wish you the best of luck. You've shared a lot of great advice with our students, and we are very grateful for it.
Likewise, I'm so grateful for people who are interested in doing this storytelling and using these expertise, because we need it. We need more people talking about these issues and coming up with creative ways to tell these stories and to bring more people into the conversation. So thank you all for the work that you do.
Thank you.